It's one of the most unbelievable stories you could ever hear.
So I'm going to try to put the nose of my airplane in your drag chute compartment and push it.
A 15-ton fighter jet, no engines, no fuel, being pushed out of enemy airspace by another.
And I pushed on it a little bit, and I could stay on there for 10 or 15 seconds. And we just kept pushing, and we'd crossed over into Laos out of North Vietnam.
But it happened, and it's not only believable, it's so well documented, it carries its own name, the Pardo Push. Fast forward to having dinner with a Vietnam ex-POW, and I asked him if anything good came out of his Vietnam experience. Funny you should say that, he said, and then he pushed across the table a folder. I'm commissioning you to draw Bob Pardo's F-4. It's one good thing that came out of Vietnam, and not just for us veterans, but for everyone anywhere. Look, if you think you've heard the Pardo story before, you haven't. And wait until you hear about the diapers and the water machine. But if you think Bob Pardo's the star of the show, he isn't. Bob was simply following orders to push someone.
I had no reservations about going over there and helping those people fight for what they wanted at all. It was a very natural thing for me to want to do.
That was Bob Pardo, and here's the setup. It's March 10th, 1967. Bob and backseater Steve Wayne are part of a four-ship that are going north to bomb a target near Hanoi. Specifically, it's a steel mill. These weren't easy targets. They were ringed with defensive fire that could kick up a ton of shrapnel and bullets.
They had 183 guns within 5 miles of the steel mill.
But the Air Force had two things going for it: accuracy and speed. On a typical four-ship, 4 F-4 Phantoms could bring about 18,000 pounds of explosives to bear on the target. And each F-4 carried about as many bombs as a World War II B-17. But their accuracy was much, much greater. In comparison, 4 F-4 Phantoms could deliver bombs so accurately they were worth a formation of 100 World War II B-17s. So, go in fast, put the bomb where it needs, and get away. That's the plan. But no plan ever survives the first 30 seconds of combat.
All the airplanes are loaded up with bombs, and everybody's cranking up at their specified time and starting to taxi out. And once we got to the target, ordinarily we would be at 14,000 feet when we rolled in on our dive bomb run. And most everybody was using a 60-degree dive because the steeper the dive, the more accurate the bombing.
In a dive, an F-4 Phantom is going about 600 knots. That's just under the speed of sound. That's 3 football fields in 1 second.
And I'm looking out the windshield at the target, and I said, this still ain't gonna do it. And so we just kept shallowing out. And I thought, we're not gonna come anywhere close to the blast furnaces.
From the time Bob rolled in, he had only about 15 seconds to line up on the target. It's focused work to maintain a 100-foot separation between others and keep a good line on the target.
But I kept seeing stuff out in front of me, and it was pontoon boats. Thousands and thousands of pontoon boats. And then they string as many as they need, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever, and pull them across with a rope. And now they've got a bridge. And daylight comes, they let it go with the flow of the river and go back to the other side and cover it up with branches and what have you, and it's hidden. Us flying around up there above it, you can't even see it. You don't even know it's there.
But on the ground, the Vietnamese were no less focused, firing back where anything the North Vietnamese could put up, from big 100mm shells to the smaller 37mm.
Earl Amon had been hit initially over the initial point for the run-in to the target.
And they were firing fast. To give you an idea, the 100mm would fire about 1 round every 4 seconds and explode in a cloud of supersonic shrapnel. And in that same time, the 37mm would fire about 16 rounds. And each one of those shells had the explosive power to bring an F-4 Phantom down.
And just as we started our roll-in, they got hit again, except this time they got hit really heavy.
If you've ever driven through a late summer mayfly hatch, the zip, zip, zip of brown bugs was sort of like flying into enemy fire. Only instead of splattering on your grill, they blow holes in your car. Which is what happened to Bob. And to Earl. Right in the fuel tanks.
When Earl checked in, he said, "I'm bingo minus 5,000 pounds," which meant he only had 2,000 pounds remaining, which wasn't even enough fuel to get out of North Vietnam, much less make it to the tanker.
Bob's leak wasn't so bad. He could make a tanker and head home. But the only option Earl had at the time was to use the last bit of fuel and act like a thrown rock on a trajectory. Of course, Earl wanted to get away. But it was really academic. The two men resigned themselves to ejecting and face whatever horror lay ahead.
So while we're climbing up, I decided to go with him.
Back then, POW treatment of American airmen, that was a sinister mystery. Torture, however, was assured. Nevertheless, Earl pointed his dying F-4 towards the Laotian border, and he and Robert prepared for the worst. But that couldn't do for Bob. That's when he decided to do the deed.
So we just stayed in military power and started climbing. And we're getting on up, and finally we got up to about 30,000, something like that. And he's down to about 400 pounds of fuel. And I said, "Well, jettison your drag chute."
That left a little divot in the back and just enough space for the nose of Bob's F-4 to fit.
So I'm going to try to put the nose of my airplane in your drag chute compartment and push it.
Between a rock and a hard place, you'll try anything, right? Well, Earl's engines were still sputtering, but not enough to maintain airspeed. However, it was enough to create some turbulence, so when Bob got his nose up there, it just didn't work.
Finally, with about 200 pounds left, so just shut it down and save that 200 pounds for a controlled ejection.
Going this far, Bob and Steve have already gone way past the call of military duty. But Bob was operating under a different duty, and he had another idea.
As I was backing out from under him, I was looking up at the tail of his airplane, and there was that big old tail hook, so I said, "Lower your hook." And I pushed on it a little bit, and I could stay on there for 10 or 15 seconds. And we could see that the rate of descent was reducing. I guess we would compare it to milking a rattlesnake. You do it very, very carefully.
Careful is right. Now, I did some figuring, and each one of those Phantoms weighed about 30,000 pounds. If you've ever seen the front windshield panel of an F-4, it's about this long and about this wide. It's heavier than you can imagine because it's armored glass, but it wasn't designed to push 30,000 pounds, especially when that 30,000 pounds is focused on a tail hook that's no bigger than a football. So Bob had to maneuver his F-4 just so that Earl's tail hook would press against the fairing about 12 inches square right in front of the windscreen. One slip and that hook could smash right into Bob and Steve. 16 tons at 250 knots, they wouldn't have felt a thing.
And we just kept pushing, and eventually we got down to about 6,000 feet. We'd crossed over into Laos out of North Vietnam. And I said, "This is as far as we can go. So you guys get out of there."
The 4 guys ejected and parachuted to safety. Well, not really, because Laos was having a war much like Vietnam was. Floating down into the jungle, the 4 men were marked and hunted just like they'd been if they were in North Vietnam.
And well, it wasn't very long. You could hear people coming up the hill, shouting, hollering, shooting rifles. Never did find out if these were friendlies or not, but when you're down behind enemy lines, best not to make contact with anybody.
But one thing about Laos, it was closer to American bases, and within 2 hours, all 4 of them were in helicopters and heading home. Okay, if you're anything like me, you're thinking this should be the end of the story, and there should be a major movie, and the names Pardo and Wayne would be just as popular as Batman and Robin. Well, that might work in Hollywood, but not in Vietnam.
So we got on the airplane, all 4 of us got on the airplane, and away we went to Yubon and had a very nice welcome home. All the guys, it was between missions, so our whole squadron was present. And we gave them a quick debrief on what had transpired, and they thought it was absolutely magnificent. About 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on the door, and the guy comes on in. Says, "Come on, you got to go with me. I got to take you down to the command post." And I walk in the command post, and there's a colonel sitting behind the desk with a telephone to his ear and saying, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," "Yes, sir." "Just a moment, sir." And he asked me a question, and then he'd talk to the general down at 7th Air Force headquarters. We had to replan the flight to show that there wasn't any way we could have got home because we didn't realize how much fuel we were leaking. We knew that there was no doubt about Earl's situation, that he couldn't have made it. That pretty much should have been the end of it. But the general down in Saigon wanted to court-martial me.
One of the questions I always ask these old guys is who they remember as a specifically great leader. The answers are always different, but the qualities are always somewhat the same too. It's kind of an alchemy of empathy, decisiveness, and old-fashioned street smarts. In the wild world of Vietnam, there were a number of leaders who had those qualities, but none were as universally appreciated as Colonel Robin Olds.
And Colonel Olds got back from his R&R, and he said, "Just hold everything." And he jumped in an airplane and went down to Saigon and talked to the commanding general.
World War II ace, and in Vietnam, an old man of 44 years old, Colonel Olds was the antithesis of the dogmatic political and bureaucratic leadership being telegraphed from Washington, D.C.
And the general told him, says, "Okay." He says, "Here's the deal. Neither one of those guys gets any recognition whatsoever. And that's it. And I won't court-martial. But there's to be no recognition." He said, "Fine." Came home. We said, "We got what we wanted already. We got our 2 buddies home. That's all we ever wanted." And then, lo and behold, 22 years later at a rat reunion, we're playing golf, and a friend of mine asked me about it. He said, what did you and Steve get?" And I said, "We didn't get anything." And he said, "Well, that's not right." He says, I worked for Senator John Tower from Texas as his military aide, and I've never asked him for a favor, but now I'm going to."
That favor was a Silver Star. It's a big deal. It's the 3rd highest military decoration for valor. But Bob and Steve didn't do the push for recognition. How do I know? Well, for one, you don't risk getting a tail hook rammed through your skull for a medal to wear. For two, with all that adrenaline flowing and razor-thin focusing, Bob and Steve had little time to conspire about their own self-interest. The medal to Bob and Steve was simply a recognition for the event. That the two weren't commended right away, that was only yet another black mark on the weird corporate politics of Vietnam. In short, the Silver Star made good on the Air Force.
So 22 years later, Steve and I were awarded the Silver Star. And that's again, where the story should have ended.
But there's a third reason, and it gets more towards the heart of a man who simply couldn't let one of his countrymen down. See, Bob got another chance to push Earl, and this time it wasn't in a Phantom, it was in a wheelchair.
But when we got the call from Lucy that Earl was sick, I was flying corporate jets at the time, and I had a few days later, 2 or 3 days later, I had a trip to San Antonio. And so I called Lucy and asked her where Earl was, and she said he's at the hospital. He said he noticed that when he would work on his car, that he was having trouble holding the wrenches, and that he couldn't make them go where he wanted them to go. And so he'd gone out to have himself checked, and that's when they told him he had ALS. It was tragic, but he was a fighter. He never gave up. He thought any day they'll find a cure for this disease. And so he just kept on fighting. And next thing you know, as his muscles deteriorated, he couldn't walk. So he needed a wheelchair. Well, they had a push chair. And I thought, man, we got to do something. And I started calling friends and saying, I need some ideas on how we can raise some money to get Eamon a wheelchair. And it was absolutely amazing. The first 7 people I called all donated $100 right on the spot. And then a friend of mine out in California says, Bob, it's going to take more than that. We've got to come up with some real money. He said, you need to start selling t-shirts. And I don't know how the word got out, but it did. And we sold all of them in 2 weeks at $20 a piece. And we started ordering more shirts. And it just kept going. And we raised close to $120,000 just selling t-shirts. We got the motorized wheelchair on one of my trips to San Antonio, and we took it to Earl. We thought, that's good. Now he can go out the front of the house, run up and down the street, and then we thought, well, he could sure use a van to get around in. I got a call from this vice chairman of General Motors. Next thing I know, we're invited to a dinner, just a luncheon, in San Antonio. And when we walked back outside, there sat the van. Earl could not believe it, just absolutely could not believe it. And he was able to roll himself up on there, and Lucy jumped in the driver's seat, and away they went.
About now, no one's going to blame you if you think Bob Pardo is some sort of superhero. When I first met Bob, he made it clear to me, though, that he felt that talking about the push was his duty, even if he got a little more tired of telling the story every time. And Bob is quick to remind people that there were 2 in that F-4 cockpit. It may be called the Pardo push, but backseater Steve Wayne, he was just as committed to helping Earl and Robert as Bob was. But Bob gets a little bit more animated telling the story of helping Earl with his ALS. But I think that's because more of how the whole river rat and business community rallied around Earl and Lucy to begin with.
I just helped Earl because he was someone I went to war with, and he deserved help.
But for me, the picture of Bob Pardo came complete when we were having dinner and Bob's wife says, Bob, tell him about the time you delivered diapers in the Coors corporate jet. Bob rolled his eyes and started to describe how Hurricane Mitch ruined Honduras in 1998.
Once again, it was a situation where something needed to be done, and it needed to be done quickly. And airplanes was the best way to do it. I said, okay, Mrs. Coors has told me that her sons will let me use the airplane to fly supplies down there. Once she told me that we could use the jet, I took off on a trip. And when we got back off this 3-day trip, they had 4 additional jet airplanes that had their companies had volunteered them to help us haul stuff down there. Some guy came up with a water distillation plant, very small, compact, that would crank out 4,000 gallons of water a day, and they didn't have any clean water down there.
From pushing Earl to pushing Earl again to pushing diapers and clean water, Bob Pardo just likes to save people's butts. But I wondered, why? And the answer to that question? So are you a natural leader?
Probably. I don't have much of a problem getting people to go along with me on many, many subjects.
Where does that come from?
Very careful choice of parents.
So what do they have to do with this?
If I had come home from Southeast Asia and told my dad that we were on this really bad mission and my friend got shot up, and I was right there with him when he had to bail out, he would have asked me, I guarantee you he would have asked me, did you try to help? And I would not have been able to come home and tell him of that situation and say, no, Dad, I didn't help. Couldn't do it. I knew he would have expected me to do something. And so I tried, and it worked.
Years ago, my son's Boy Scout troop leader was giving advice to new dads. And he said this, your job isn't to make those boys follow you. Your job is to be worth following. When Bob had said that he made careful choice of his parents, my mind went back to that day at my kid's first troop meeting. And it was then that I understood that the Pardo push wasn't a single act of bravery, but one of many proofs that Bob was simply following a push himself. Look, we all want our kids to succeed and achieve and make their way in the world, and the world is going to put up an awful lot of resistance unless we teach them to push back, like Bob's dad taught him. This is proudly dedicated to the man behind Bob, William Roland Pardo.